Hello, this is Brandon Hadnot, and I'm just here to teach you guys a little bit about Adobe After Effects. So here's an example of what we're going to make in Adobe After Effects with this really basic tutorial. Super exciting. Today's tutorial is going to be about starting out in After Effects with a basic project. And from start to finish, you're going to learn how to start a new project, animate something very simply, and then you're going to learn how to render that project to your drive so that then you could play it back. So in Adobe After Effects, either you're greeted with a starting screen that'll show your most recent files, or like me, you might have it set to a default where you just start right here at this blank window where it's asking you if you want to make a new composition or a new composition from footage. So I'm going to click New Composition. So the first thing that's going to pop up is the Composition Settings window. And one thing that's very important that's easily overlooked is not naming your comp. I would suggest that you always name your comp, no matter how simple or silly the name might be. It's just better for project organization and workflow later down the road. So I'm going to name this My First Comp, short for composition. And then we're going to move on down here. Now, since I'm keeping this tutorial basic, I'm going to stay inside of the basic tab of the composition settings here. We'll cover these other things in the future. So now that that's out of the way, we're just going to choose this drop down and make sure that we have HD TV 1080-24 selected. But what do those numbers mean? We have 1920 by 1080. So the width is 1920 pixels and the height is 1080 pixels. And then the frame rate is 24 frames per second. And that's pretty standard when it comes to dealing with video and animation. But if you want to experiment with having more frames per second to maybe see if you can get smoother animation out of whatever it is you're doing in After Effects, you can feel free to do that. Just know that lesser frames means more choppy animation. More frames means smoother animation when you're dealing with animation by itself, or if you're dealing with video that was already shot at that frame rate and then you just wanted to match it. Resolution is set to half, but you could have it at full depending on what it is you're about to do. Depending on what type of machine you're working on, what type of computer you have, or what type of graphics card you have, you want to make sure that you're not overworking your computer. Even people who have great computers and the best specs on their computer just operate at half resolution, or they use proxies so that their workflow is not interrupted by a lot of different lag. Duration is where we look next, and one thing I like to explain to people from left to right is how this works. So on the right we have milliseconds, seconds, minutes, hours. I, in my almost 10 years of using Adobe After Effects, have never had a composition last more than a few minutes. Definitely never had one that lasted an hour, but if you've got it like that and your computer can handle that without exploding, then kudos to you. So we'll set this comp duration to 10 seconds, and then for background color we're just going to select that. I typically do white or black because I end up replacing it anyway, so it doesn't really matter, for me at least. But we're going to start out with black because we're going to do a basic animation here and get started. So we'll click OK. Alright, so the first thing that I want to show you is inside of the composition window, this is basically our canvas. And then if we look over here in the project window, you'll see My First Comp highlighted there. If you double clicked it, nothing would happen because we're already inside of our composition window. So just make sure that you're able to identify this symbol, meaning that it means comp or composition. And you can see that symbol down here as well. And when you hover over it, you'll see a tooltip that says Create New Composition, which would just take us through the same settings before and make a secondary comp. I'll click Cancel on that. So in the project window, you can do a couple of things. But the main thing that this is for is dragging your project assets into it so that you can then use them inside of your composition. Whether you're on a Windows computer or a Mac, you can use the Windows Explorer or the Finder to take your files and drag and drop them into the project window in After Effects. After a little while, they'll finally appear inside of there, and then you're able to just drag one of those into your composition however you need to. In the next tutorial, I'll be actually using these assets, but for this one, I'm just going to use a simple shape tool up here in the toolbar, which is the rectangle tool. So I'm going to click the rectangle tool, and I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm just going to click and drag inside of that composition window there. And I like to drag my shapes from the center, so I'm not letting go of Shift, and I'm going to hold Control at the same time. If you're using a Mac, it's going to be the Command key. So that's there, and the anchor point's a little off center, so I guess this is a good time to show you how to use that too. So the anchor point right here is a little off center, so I'm going to go ahead and choose the Pan Behind or Anchor Point tool, which the shortcut for is Y, and I'm just going to drag from the anchor point here. So if I drag this, you'll see that the anchor point is moving around a bit. If I hold the Alt key while dragging it, it will drag the shape around the anchor point. But if I hold the Control key, or if you're on a Mac, it would be the Command key. If you're on a Mac, it would be the Command key. We can just have it snap to whatever point we want out of these different points on this shape. Now it's all nice and neat and our anchor point is in the center. I'll show you why really quickly, why it's important for that to be in the center if you're trying to rotate it from the center. So I'm bringing up rotation for the shape, and again, you can do that with a shortcut key. You can just hit the letter R to bring that up, and it's going from the center. But if I hit Y, take the anchor point tool and drag that anchor point and hold Control or Command and snap it to one of those edges, now it's going to rotate from that because this is now the center of its axis. Okay. Really quickly, we're going to go through a basic animation. Just moving this square from one side of the composition to the other. Inside of the layer panel down here, we're just going to hit this drop down arrow, and then we're going to look at all these different transform options. So down here you see anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. So position, we'll move it left, right, up and down as long as it's a 2D layer. Scale, we'll scale it up and down. Rotation, we'll rotate it along its axis. Opacity, we'll bring it from full transparency to complete solid state, from 0 to 100. And right now we're only going to deal with the position. So it's already over here on the left side of the map. I'm going to go ahead and click on position here, and I'm going to move the playhead on the timeline out to 2 seconds. And now I'm going to take position while I'm out here and move it until I get this square just about across the composition. So when I take this playhead, this little blue marker right here, and move it left and right, now my square is actually moving. I could even take it back to the beginning and hit the space bar, and it'll play up until that point. You'll see that since we made changes on the timeline, after clicking the stopwatch, which is now highlighted blue, it created what is called a keyframe. And keyframes record the data of whatever values are being changed inside of the timeline. So I'll do that one more time really quickly. So I clicked this stopwatch right here, and it turned blue, and a keyframe was automatically created. And then I moved out to 2 seconds. And then once I changed the x-axis, because if there's two numbers, it's x and y. Once I started dragging this across the way here, you can see that motion path, and you can see that a keyframe was also created automatically where my playhead was stationed. Alright, so if you hit the space bar, or if you go up to the preview panel and hit play, you'll see your animation play all the way through. Now there are a couple things also to deal with in the timeline here. So you'll see some of these checkboxes right here that look a little blank and a little weird. If you don't see those, you can go down to the bottom of the screen right here and click Toggle Switches and Modes and bring those back up. Now the first box here is Motion Blur, and that simulates shutter duration, which basically is going to add some slight motion lines to your object when you turn it on. Turning this on means that we would also need to turn on the Motion Blur switch, which will not work unless we actually click that. Motion blur is more dramatic when speed is involved, so we'll have that cover that distance in half the time. There we go. Okay, so we've got our basic animation as promised, and I just wanted to make sure that I covered some of the most basic things to do in After Effects when you first open up the program so that you're a little bit more comfortable with the software. One thing that's going to be really important after we have our basic animation here is to just make sure that we don't have a bunch of empty space at the end of our video, because obviously there's nothing happening after that. But I will leave about a second or two. I'll make maybe the comp 3 seconds long. And if you see this gray bar here with the blue tips, you can drag this time ruler to adjust the workspace of the actual comp to the playhead, which means it's only going to render 3 seconds worth of whatever's happening in between this space on the timeline. If you're into hotkeys like me, if that was at the end there, you can just hit the letter N to move your workspace to wherever your playhead is stationed. On the opposite end of that, you can hit the letter B to move it to wherever your playhead is at before the end. So we have this basic little animation here, and maybe we'll add in one super weird and random little piece of movement right here. So it goes from left to right, but if I move in the middle of these keyframes there and just move this in the air a little bit by sliding the y-axis number to the left, which means it's going to go up. Now it takes a little jump for no exact reason at all. So while we're at it, just going to hit the stopwatch for rotation. And then I'm going to move towards the end where that last keyframe for position popped up. And I'm just going to click the first number for rotation and type in a 1 and hit enter. And what that is saying is that from start to finish, it's going to rotate one full time. It's going to revolve one full time, 360 degrees, and then nothing. So if I dial this back, I can see now that my square actually does a little flip. I'll hit the space bar to play it. Boom. We have a nice simple little animation of this square jumping from left to right in our composition. Okay, so the entire purpose of this tutorial was to get you introduced to some keyframes, importing some project files that we didn't use. We won't use those until the next tutorial that's going to pop up after this one, and also to get you to be able to save your project first. So we're going to go ahead and do that as well. We're going to go to File, Save, name it My First Comp, and hit Save. Okay, so we got a nice basic little composition. It only lasts, for 3 seconds, so it'll eventually loop back at the beginning there and just keep on playing over and over again. But that all depends on how you have your settings. Over here in Preview, you can click to change that so it only plays once, but I like for it to play over and over again so I can watch it 1,000 times, review it, and see if there's anything I could change. But the next and final step is we're going to go to File, and then we're going to go to Export, Add to Render Queue. Now you're going to see 3 blue links on here. You'll see Render Settings, Output Module, and the Output To. And Output To is the first one I click because I like to tell myself where I'm going to actually save it. And I'll just save it inside of its own little folder and click Save. Now between Windows and Mac you might see some different options in here, but for this we can go ahead and just save it as a QuickTime video. QuickTime is a QuickTime movie files is pretty much a lossless format for the most part, and we can just go ahead and click OK down here. And output 2, we've already determined where it's going to go. And then next you're just going to go ahead and hit the render button. Cool. Alright, that's that. So now if you look inside of your folders, you should be able to see. Okay, so now you'll be able to see what you've made. You'll be able to play it back, and boom, you've got your animation. Alright, that pretty much wraps it up for this tutorial. Just wanted to show you some of the basics of using Adobe After Effects when it came to starting up a new project file, choosing your composition settings, importing files, creating a basic shape layer, animating that using keyframes, saving it, and then rendering and exporting it. I hope you found this helpful. Check out my next tutorials, which will deal with some things like some basic color keying and even some more advanced things like using the camera tracking abilities inside of Adobe After Effects. Again, this is Brandon Hadnot. Thank you for watching.